Emily Walker's wrench slipped as she heard the engines thundering overhead. The restored B-17 Flying Fortress cast its shadow across the airfield, its silver wings gleaming in the afternoon sun. What started as a young woman's stubborn refusal to let history rust away had become something extraordinary. The Air Force officers standing beside her weren't just impressed, they were stunned. This wasn't just any restored aircraft, it was the ghost of the Pacific, a bomber that had vanished 70 years ago carrying secrets that families had died hoping to uncover. But how did a small-town mechanic accomplish what museums and military restoration teams had deemed impossible? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 years earlier, Emily Walker had been nothing more than another grease-stained mechanic in the forgotten town of Cedar Falls, population 2,000 and declining. At 24, she possessed calloused hands that could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, and a stubborn streak that had gotten her into more trouble than her grandmother could count. The local garage where she worked barely paid enough to cover rent on her cramped studio apartment, but Emily had grown accustomed to making do with less. The autumn morning that changed everything started like any other. Emily was walking through the overgrown Hensley property on the outskirts of town, searching for salvageable parts from the collection of rusted vehicles that old man Hensley had accumulated over decades. The property had been abandoned since his death 2 years prior, and his distant relatives had given Emily permission to scavenge what she needed in exchange for clearing some of the mess. She was picking through a pile of transmission parts when something caught her eye through a gap in the towering weeds. Metal, definitely, but the shape was wrong for a car or truck. Emily pushed through the thorny undergrowth, ignoring the scratches on her arms, until she found herself standing before something that made her heart skip a beat. Half buried in decades of accumulated debris and vegetation was the unmistakable silhouette of an aircraft wing. The metal was covered in rust and corrosion, painted over by time and weather, but the distinctive shape was undeniable. Emily circled the area, pushing aside more weeds, until the full scope of what lay hidden became clear. It was a bomber, massive and imposing even in its decrepit state, nose down in the earth as if it had crash-landed and been forgotten by the world. The cockpit windows were spiderwebbed with cracks, the propellers bent and twisted, but Emily could see past the damage to the incredible machine that lay beneath. This wasn't just any aircraft. The size and configuration suggested it was a World War II heavy bomber, possibly a B-17 Flying Fortress. She had studied enough aviation history to recognize the distinctive lines and proportions, even under all that rust and neglect. Emily's mind raced as she examined the wreckage more closely. How had this ended up here? Cedar Falls was nowhere near any military base or flight path she knew of. The plane appeared to have been here for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. She found what looked like part of a serial number on the fuselage, though most of it was obscured by corrosion. That evening, Emily couldn't focus on anything else. She researched military aircraft databases online, trying to piece together any information about crashed bombers in the area. The search yielded frustratingly little, just a few mentions of training accidents during the war and routine flights that had experienced mechanical failures. Nothing that would explain how a massive bomber had ended up buried in weeds behind Cedar Falls. The next morning, she returned to the site with her toolbox and a camera. If no one else cared about this piece of history, she would. Emily had never tackled anything remotely this ambitious. Her experience was limited to cars, trucks, and the occasional motorcycle. But something about the forgotten bomber called to her. Perhaps it was the challenge, or maybe just her inability to walk away from anything mechanical that needed fixing. She started small, clearing away decades of accumulated debris and vegetation. The work was backbreaking, requiring her to crawl through tight spaces and haul away wheelbarrows full of rusted metal and rotted wood. But with each layer of neglect she removed, more of the aircraft's original structure became visible. The townspeople thought she had lost her mind. Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store shook her head whenever Emily came in covered in rust stains and scratches. "That girl's wasting her youth on a pile of scrap metal," she would mutter to anyone who would listen. The comment stung, But Emily had learned long ago to ignore the opinions of people who had never taken a risk in their lives. Her boss at the garage, Frank Morrison, was more direct in his disapproval. "You spending too much time on that junk heap," he told her one afternoon when she showed up to work with fresh cuts on her arms from wrestling with twisted metal. "It's affecting your focus here, and frankly, I can't afford to have mechanics who aren't giving their full attention to paying customers." Emily wanted to argue, to explain that working on the bomber was teaching her things about aircraft engines and mechanical systems that no amount of car repair could provide. But Frank had already made up his mind, and she needed the paycheck too much to push the issue. So she began working on the bomber in secret, arriving at the site before dawn and staying until well after sunset. She borrowed equipment from the garage when Frank wasn't looking, hauling generators and power tools through the woods to the hidden aircraft. The physical demands were enormous. Every component had to be carefully documented, photographed, and either restored or completely rebuilt. The engines were her first major challenge. The four Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engines were seized solid, their internal components fused together by decades of moisture and corrosion. Emily had to learn entirely new mechanical principles, studying aircraft engine manuals she ordered online, and watching instructional videos until her eyes burned from staring at her laptop screen. Each engine had to be completely disassembled, every component cleaned, measured, and evaluated for restoration or replacement. The pistons were scored beyond repair, requiring Emily to machine new ones on the garage's lathe during her lunch breaks. The crankshafts had to be reground and rebalanced, a process that took her months to complete working with hand tools and improvised equipment. The electrical systems presented another enormous challenge. Decades of exposure had reduced most of the wiring to green copper dust, and many of the instruments had been destroyed by moisture and rodents. Emily spent countless hours studying electrical schematics, tracing circuits, and learning to read the technical documentation that would guide her restoration efforts. Local parts suppliers were useless for her needs. Components for a 1940s bomber weren't exactly stocked at the Cedar Falls Auto Parts store. Emily became expert at sourcing materials online, finding surplus military parts dealers, aircraft salvage yards, and specialty machine shops that could fabricate components she couldn't make herself. The financial strain was crushing. Her modest salary from the garage barely covered her basic living expenses, and now she was pouring every spare dollar into the restoration project. She sold her car and started riding a bicycle to work, lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. But every time she considered giving up, she would look at the progress she had made and find the determination to continue. The bomber's structure required extensive metalwork. Decades of corrosion had eaten through sections of the fuselage, wings, and control surfaces. Emily taught herself welding and metal fabrication, practicing on scrap pieces until she could create patches that were both structurally sound and historically accurate. She studied photographs of other restored B-17 to ensure her work matched the original specifications. The control systems were a nightmare of corroded cables, seized pulleys, and destroyed hydraulic components. Emily had to rebuild everything from scratch, carefully routing new cables through the aircraft's framework and calibrating the controls so they would respond properly. She had no way to test most of her work until the entire system was complete, creating enormous pressure to get every detail exactly right the first time. 2 years into the project, Emily's secret was discovered when a group of hikers got lost and stumbled across the restoration site. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls about the crazy mechanic girl who was trying to rebuild a crashed bomber by herself. The reaction was mixed. Some people were impressed by her dedication and skill, while others saw it as an expensive folly that proved she had lost touch with reality. The attention brought both welcome and unwelcome developments. A local newspaper reporter wrote a story about Emily's project, which led to several aviation enthusiasts offering to volunteer their time and expertise. But it also attracted the attention of county officials, who wanted to know if she had proper permits for the restoration work and whether the aircraft posed any environmental hazards. Emily managed to satisfy the bureaucrats by proving that the plane contained no hazardous materials and that her work was actually improving the environmental condition of the site by removing decades of free, accumulated pollutants. The volunteer helpers were a mixed blessing. She appreciated their enthusiasm and knowledge, but she had grown protective of the project and found it difficult to delegate tasks she had been handling alone for so long. The breakthrough came during the third winter of the restoration. Emily had been working on the electrical systems for months, painstakingly rewiring every circuit and replacing components that had been destroyed by corrosion. When she finally connected the restored batteries and threw the master power switch, instrument panels that had been dark for 70 years suddenly flickered to life. The moment was electric, literally and figuratively. Gauges moved, warning lights illuminated, and for the first time since she had discovered the bomber, Emily could see evidence of the sophisticated aircraft that lay beneath all the rust and damage. She sat in the restored pilot's seat, hands on the controls, and for a brief moment, she could imagine what it had been like for the men who had flown this machine into combat decades before she was born. The engine tests came next, and they were terrifying. Emily had rebuilt the 4 massive radial engines completely, but she had no way to know if her work was correct until she actually tried to start them. She had constructed a makeshift test stand using salvaged materials, but the setup still felt dangerously improvised for testing engines that produced over 1,000 horsepower each. The first engine coughed and died immediately, sending Emily's heart into her throat. She spent 3 days troubleshooting the fuel delivery system before discovering that a tiny piece of debris had blocked one of the fuel injectors. The second attempt was more successful. The engine caught and ran roughly for nearly a minute before shutting down due to what turned out to be a timing issue. But when the engine ran smoothly for the first time, the sound was unlike anything Emily had ever experienced. The deep, rhythmic roar of the Wright Cyclone engine reverberated through the forest, powerful enough to shake leaves from the trees and send wildlife fleeing for cover. It was the sound of history coming back to life, and Emily found herself crying tears of joy and exhaustion. The restoration took another 6 months to complete. Emily had to rebuild the landing gear, restore the bomb bay mechanisms, and reconstruct large sections of the interior. She fabricated new seats, instrument panels, and control cables, working from technical manuals and reference photographs to ensure historical accuracy. The paint scheme was particularly challenging, requiring research into the specific squadron markings and nose art that would have been used on this particular aircraft. When local aviation enthusiasts heard that Emily was close to completing the restoration, word spread through networks of warbird collectors and military history buffs. People began making pilgrimages to Cedar Falls just to see the bomber that a small-town mechanic had brought back from the dead. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent 3 years working in solitude, but Emily was proud to show off her accomplishment. The day Emily fired up all 4 engines simultaneously was a moment that would be remembered in Cedar Falls for generations. The sound was incredible. 4 massive radial engines producing a symphony of mechanical precision that could be heard for miles. People came running from all directions, drawn by the unmistakable sound of a World War II bomber at full power. But the real surprise came when the aircraft began to move. Emily had secretly been working on making the bomber airworthy, not just a static display. She had obtained her private pilot's license during the restoration, studying aviation regulations and aircraft systems with the same intensity she had brought to the mechanical work. When she advanced the throttles, and the massive bomber began rolling across the improvised runway she had cleared in the adjacent field, spectators could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The takeoff was everything Emily had dreamed of, and more. The bomber lifted off the ground with surprising grace, its restored engines pulling the aircraft into the sky as if the past 70 years had been nothing more than a brief maintenance stop. Emily could hardly believe she was actually flying the machine she had spent 3 years rebuilding with her own hands. But the flight would prove to be more significant than anyone could have imagined. Within hours of Emily's successful test flight, her phone was ringing with calls from aviation museums, military historians, and government officials. The story of the small-town mechanic who had restored a B-17 bomber was spreading across social media and news networks. But there was another dimension to the story that Emily was about to discover. The call that changed everything came from Colonel Rebecca Hayes of the United States Air Force Museum. Her voice was professional, but tinged with excitement as she asked Emily specific questions about the aircraft's serial numbers, markings, and configuration. Emily answered as best she could, but she sensed that the colonel knew more about the bomber than she was letting on. "Miss Walker," Colonel Hayes said carefully, "I need to ask you to keep that aircraft grounded until we can arrange to have our team examine it. Based on your description, there's a possibility that you've restored something quite significant from a historical perspective." Emily was puzzled by the request, but she agreed to cooperate. The bomber had already exceeded her wildest expectations by actually flying, and she was curious about what had captured the Air Force's interest so intensely. She had assumed the plane was just another training aircraft, or perhaps a bomber that had been damaged and abandoned after the war. The team that arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days later was unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Air Force historians, technical specialists, and museum curators descended on the restoration site with equipment and expertise that made Emily's improvised workshop look primitive by comparison. They photographed every detail of the aircraft, documented serial numbers she hadn't even noticed, and asked her hundreds of questions about what she had found during the restoration process. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more incredible than any fiction Emily could have imagined. The bomber she had spent 3 years restoring wasn't just any B-17. It was the Ghost of the Pacific, an aircraft that had vanished during a classified mission in 1945 and been presumed lost with all hands. The plane had been carrying experimental radar equipment and sensitive intelligence documents when it disappeared, launching decades of speculation about what had happened to the crew and their secret cargo. Colonel Hayes explained that the Ghost of the Pacific had been part of a special operations squadron tasked with testing new technology and conducting reconnaissance missions in the final months of the war. The bomber and its crew of 8 had taken off from a base in California for what was supposed to be a routine training flight, but they had never returned. Search efforts at the time had found no trace of the aircraft, leading military investigators to conclude that it had crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The discovery that the plane had actually made an emergency landing in the woods behind Cedar Falls raised more questions than it answered. How had the crew survived? What had happened to the classified equipment they were carrying? Why had no one reported the crash? Emily's restoration had inadvertently uncovered one of the military's longest-standing mysteries. The investigation that followed involved interviews with elderly residents who might have remembered unusual events from the 1940s. Gradually, a picture emerged of what had likely happened. The bomber had apparently developed engine problems during its flight and made an emergency landing in what was then a remote field far from town. Local residents, sworn to secrecy by military personnel, had helped recover the crew and classified materials, while the damaged aircraft was simply abandoned and forgotten. The families of the Ghost of the Pacific's crew had been living with uncertainty for 70 years, not knowing whether their loved ones had died in combat or been captured as prisoners of war. Emily's restoration had provided the final piece of evidence that the crew had survived the mission, at least initially. Military records showed that several crew members had indeed returned to active duty after being reported missing, but the connection to the Ghost of the Pacific had been lost in bureaucratic confusion. The revelation transformed Emily from a small-town mechanic into something approaching a national hero. Her story was featured on news programs across the country, and aviation magazines wrote detailed articles about her incredible restoration achievement. She was invited to speak at air shows and military ceremonies, sharing the story of how determination and mechanical skill had solved a decades-old mystery. But for Emily, the most meaningful recognition came from the families of the Ghost of the Pacific's crew. She received letters and phone calls from children and grandchildren of the men who had flown the bomber, thanking her for giving them closure about their loved one's fate. Several family members traveled to Cedar Falls to see the restored aircraft and meet the woman who had brought their family history back to life. The Air Force offered to purchase the bomber for display in their museum, recognizing both its historical significance and Emily's incredible restoration work. The price they offered was enough to transform Emily's life, providing financial security she had never imagined possible. But more important than the money was the recognition of her achievement and the knowledge that her work had helped solve a mystery that had haunted families for generations. Emily's story became a symbol of what could be accomplished through determination, skill, and refusal to accept that something was impossible. She had started with nothing more than a rusted wreck hidden in the weeds, and transformed it into a flying testament to both historical preservation and individual achievement. The small-town mechanic who people had dismissed as wasting her youth on scrap metal had actually been preserving a piece of national heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. The Ghost of the Pacific now resides in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where millions of visitors can see the bomber that Emily Walker brought back from the dead. A plaque next to the aircraft tells the story of both the original crew who flew dangerous missions during wartime and the determined young woman who ensured their story wouldn't be forgotten. Emily used her newfound fame and financial resources to establish the Walker Aviation Heritage Foundation, dedicated to preserving and restoring historic aircraft. She recruited other mechanics and aviation enthusiasts to help save aircraft that might otherwise be lost to time and neglect, passing on the skills and passion that had driven her own incredible achievement. The Foundation's first major project was restoring a '51 Mustang fighter that had been discovered in a barn in rural Montana. Emily approached this restoration with the same methodical dedication that had made the Ghost of the Pacific project successful, but now she had proper facilities, adequate funding, and a team of skilled volunteers to help with the work. As she stood in her new workshop, watching volunteers carefully disassemble the Mustang's corroded engine, Emily reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had pushed through the weeds and discovered the bomber. The financial rewards had been beyond her wildest dreams, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that she had preserved something important for future generations. The phone call that had started everything still amazed her. Colonel Hayes had become a close friend and regular collaborator, helping Emily navigate the complex world of military aircraft restoration and historical preservation. The Air Force had provided technical support and documentation for several of the Foundation's projects, recognizing that passionate civilian restorers like Emily often accomplished things that official programs couldn't manage. Emily had also become something of a celebrity in the aviation community, regularly invited to speak at conferences and air shows about her restoration techniques and philosophy. She always emphasized that her success had come not from formal training or expensive equipment, but from careful observation, persistent problem-solving, and refusal to accept that something couldn't be fixed. Her story had inspired countless other people to tackle ambitious restoration projects of their own. Emily received emails from around the world, from mechanics who had discovered old aircraft in barns and hangars, asking for advice on how to approach their own restorations. She tried to answer every inquiry, remembering how isolated and uncertain she had felt during the early stages of her own project. The Foundation had grown beyond Emily's original vision, attracting support from aviation companies, military veterans, and history enthusiasts who appreciated the importance of preserving these mechanical artifacts. Corporate sponsors provided funding and equipment, while volunteer networks helped locate and document aircraft that needed attention. But Emily never lost sight of the personal satisfaction that had driven her original project. Late at night, when the workshop was quiet and she could work alone on a particularly challenging problem, she still felt the same sense of connection to the machines and the people who had originally built and flown them. Every restored rivet, every rebuilt component, was a small victory against the forces of time and neglect. The Ghost of the Pacific had taught her that history wasn't just something that happened to other people in distant times and places. It was all around, waiting to be discovered and preserved by anyone willing to look carefully and work hard enough to bring it back to life. Emily had found her calling in that overgrown field behind Cedar Falls, and she had transformed not just a rusted bomber, but her own understanding of what one person could accomplish with enough determination and skill. Years later, when aviation historians wrote about the preservation of World War II aircraft, Emily Walker's name would be mentioned alongside the great restorers and collectors who had saved these machines for future generations. But for Emily, the greatest reward would always be that moment when an engine that had been silent for decades suddenly roared back to life, carrying with it the voices of all the people who had built it, flown it, and now preserved it for the future. The Ghost of the Pacific had found its way home, and in the process, Emily Walker had discovered that sometimes the most important discoveries are hidden in the most unlikely places. waiting for someone with the vision to see past the rust and decay to the history that lies beneath. The Air Force had been shocked by what she accomplished, but Emily had shocked herself even more, proving that with enough determination and skill, even the most impossible dreams could take flight. The months following the Ghost of the Pacific's official recognition brought changes to Emily's life that she struggled to process. Media attention continued to flood in from around the world, with documentary filmmakers wanting to tell her story and aviation museums requesting her expertise on their own restoration projects. The small studio apartment that had once seemed adequate now felt cramped, with boxes of fan mail, technical manuals, and aircraft parts that people kept sending her. Emily found herself facing a decision that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Major aviation companies were offering her lucrative consulting positions. Prestigious museums wanted her to lead their restoration departments, and wealthy collectors were willing to pay extraordinary sums for her services. The financial security she had dreamed of during those lean years eating ramen noodles and riding her bicycle to work was now within reach. But success brought its own complications. Emily discovered that fame was a double-edged sword, bringing opportunities she had never imagined alongside pressures and expectations that sometimes felt overwhelming. Television producers wanted her to star in reality shows about aircraft restoration, but their vision involved manufactured drama and artificial deadlines that went against everything Emily believed about careful, methodical craftsmanship. The decision to establish the Walker Aviation Heritage Foundation had been driven partly by Emily's desire to maintain control over her work while creating something meaningful for the future. She had seen too many historical aircraft rot away in private collections or be restored incorrectly by well-meaning but inexperienced enthusiasts. The foundation would provide a way to share knowledge, coordinate preservation efforts, and ensure that future restorations met the highest standards of historical accuracy. Finding the right location for the foundation's headquarters proved to be a challenge that tested Emily's newfound business skills. She needed facilities large enough to house multiple aircraft restoration projects, with adequate workshop space, climate control, and security. The rural setting that had been perfect for her solitary work on the Ghost of the Pacific wouldn't suffice for an operation that might employ dozens of specialists and host educational programs for the public. After months of searching, Emily found the perfect property on the outskirts of Riverside, a mid-sized city about an hour's drive from Cedar Falls. The site had previously housed a small aircraft manufacturing company that had closed during the economic downturn of the early 2000s. The existing hangars and workshop facilities needed extensive renovation, but the bones of the infrastructure were solid, and the location provided easy access to transportation networks while maintaining the privacy needed for detailed restoration work. The renovation project became Emily's second major undertaking, requiring skills in construction management and business planning that she had never needed before. She found herself learning about building codes, environmental regulations, and historic preservation requirements, while simultaneously overseeing the restoration of the P-51 Mustang that had become the Foundation's first official project. The Mustang restoration presented different challenges than the Ghost of the Pacific had. While the bomber had been abandoned and forgotten, allowing Emily to work on it without interference, the fighter plane's restoration was being documented for educational purposes from the very beginning. Every step of the process was photographed and filmed, creating a permanent record that would help train future restorers while showing the public what was involved in bringing these historical aircraft back to life. Emily hired her first full-time employee 6 months after establishing the foundation. Jake Rodriguez was a recently retired Air Force mechanic who had spent 30 years maintaining modern military aircraft, but had always dreamed of working on the vintage planes he had admired since childhood. His experience with military specifications and technical documentation proved invaluable as Emily began developing standardized procedures for the Foundation's restoration projects. The partnership between Emily and Jake evolved into something more than just employer and employee. Jake's systematic approach to project management complemented Emily's intuitive understanding of mechanical systems, and his experience with military bureaucracy helped navigate the complex regulations governing the restoration of aircraft that had once been classified as military equipment. Their first major disagreement came over the level of modification that should be permitted in restoration projects. Emily believed in maintaining absolute historical accuracy, even when original specifications resulted in aircraft that were more difficult to maintain or operate safely. Jake argued that certain updates, particularly in areas like electrical systems and safety equipment, were necessary to ensure that restored aircraft could be operated safely in modern airspace. The debate was more than philosophical. It had practical implications for every project the Foundation undertook. Historical purists insisted that any deviation from original specifications compromised the educational and commemorative value of restored aircraft. Safety advocates pointed out that vintage aircraft systems had been designed for wartime conditions where mechanical reliability was balanced against mission requirements that no longer existed. Emily ultimately developed a compromise approach that became known as the Walker Standard within the aviation restoration community. Critical safety systems could be updated using modern components, but only if the modifications were completely reversible and thoroughly documented. Visual appearance had to remain absolutely faithful to historical specifications, but hidden improvements in areas like wiring, hydraulics, and engine monitoring were permitted if they enhanced safety without altering the aircraft's authentic appearance or performance characteristics. The Foundation's reputation for excellence attracted attention from unexpected sources. The Smithsonian Institution approached Emily about collaborating on the restoration of several aircraft in their collection that had been displayed for decades without proper conservation. The project would require Emily's team to work within the constraints of a museum environment while maintaining public access to the aircraft, creating logistical challenges unlike anything they had previously encountered. The Smithsonian project also introduced Emily to the politics of historical preservation. Different factions within the museum community held strong opinions about how historical artifacts should be preserved and displayed. Some curators believed that aircraft should be maintained in their current condition, showing the effects of age and use as part of their historical story. Others argued that restoration to original condition provided a more accurate representation of what the aircraft had been like when they were actively used. Emily found herself in the middle of debates that had been raging within the museum community for decades. Her practical experience with restoration gave her insights that purely academic historians might lack, but she also had to learn to navigate institutional hierarchies and bureaucratic procedures that were foreign to someone who had learned her craft working alone in the woods behind Cedar Falls. The Foundation's educational programs began almost by accident, when a local high school teacher brought her students to tour the Mustang restoration. Emily had never considered herself a teacher, but she found that explaining the technical aspects of aircraft systems to curious teenagers came naturally. The students' enthusiasm reminded her of her own fascination with mechanical systems, and their questions often forced her to think about familiar processes in new ways. Word of Emily's teaching ability spread through educational networks, leading to requests from schools, youth organizations, and adult education programs. The Foundation began offering structured workshops on aircraft maintenance, metalworking, and historical research methods. Emily discovered that teaching not only provided additional funding for restoration projects, but also helped identify young people who might become the next generation of aviation preservationists. One of Emily's most promising students was Maria Santos, a 17-year-old from a low-income family who had never seen an airplane up close before visiting the Foundation's facility. Maria displayed an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that reminded Emily of herself at that age, along with an artistic sensibility that influenced her approach to metalworking and surface preparation. Emily began mentoring Maria individually, teaching her advanced restoration techniques while encouraging her to pursue formal education in engineering or aviation technology. The relationship gave Emily perspective on how much her own life had changed since she had been a young woman with limited opportunities and big dreams. She established a scholarship program to help students like Maria access educational opportunities that might otherwise be beyond their reach. The Foundation's work began attracting international attention when Emily agreed to consult on the restoration of a British Spitfire that had been discovered in a peat bog in Scotland. The aircraft had been preserved in remarkable condition by the acidic bog water, but extracting and transporting it without causing damage required expertise that few people possessed. Emily's reputation for solving seemingly impossible restoration challenges made her the obvious choice to lead the project. The Scotland project introduced Emily to the global community of aviation historians and restoration specialists. She discovered that her work on the Ghost of the Pacific had established her reputation far beyond American borders, with European museums and collectors seeking her advice on their own challenging projects. The international connections also provided access to parts and materials that were difficult to obtain in the United States, expanding the Foundation's capabilities significantly. But the Scotland project also presented Emily with her most difficult professional challenge to date. The Spitfire's recovery had been funded by a wealthy collector who expected to take possession of the restored aircraft for his private collection. Local historians argued that the plane should remain in Scotland as part of their national heritage, while the landowner who had discovered it claimed legal ownership. Emily found herself caught between competing interests that had nothing to do with the technical aspects of restoration. The legal and ethical complexities of the Spitfire case forced Emily to develop new policies for the Foundation regarding ownership and custody of restored aircraft. She established a set of principles that prioritized historical significance and public access over financial considerations, even when doing so meant turning down lucrative contracts. The Walker Principles, as they became known, influenced restoration practices throughout the aviation preservation community. Emily's growing reputation brought her into contact with surviving World War II veterans who had flown the aircraft she was restoring. These meetings provided insights into how the planes had actually been used in combat, information that couldn't be found in technical manuals or historical documents. The veteran stories also gave Emily a deeper appreciation for the human dimension of the machines she was preserving. One particularly memorable encounter occurred when Harold Chen, a 93-year-old former B-17 pilot, visited the Foundation to see the restored Ghost of the Pacific. Harold had flown similar missions to the one that had ended with the bomber's emergency landing, and his descriptions of combat conditions helped Emily understand design features that had puzzled her during the restoration process. The meeting was emotional for both of them, connecting Harold's wartime memories with Emily's present-day preservation efforts. Harold's visit led to the Foundation establishing an oral history project, recording interviews with surviving veterans who could provide first-hand accounts of flying and maintaining the aircraft being restored. The recordings became valuable educational resources, but they also served as reminders that the generation that had built and flown these planes was rapidly disappearing. Emily felt a growing sense of urgency about preserving not just the aircraft themselves, but the knowledge and memories of the people who had given them life. The Foundation's success created new challenges as Emily struggled to balance her desire for hands-on restoration work with the administrative responsibilities of running a growing organization. Board meetings, budget reviews, and strategic planning sessions took time away from the workshop activities that had originally inspired her passion for aviation preservation. She found herself longing for the simplicity of working alone on the Ghost of the Pacific, when her biggest worry had been whether she could afford replacement parts. Emily's solution was to hire professional administrators to handle the Foundation's business operations while she focused on technical and educational activities. This decision required her to trust others with aspects of the organization she had previously controlled personally, a difficult transition for someone who had learned to be self-reliant through years of independent work. The first major test of the new organizational structure came when the Foundation was offered an opportunity to restore an entire squadron of World War II fighters that had been discovered in a sealed underground hangar in Brest, Eastern Europe. The project would be the largest aviation restoration undertaking ever attempted, requiring resources and coordination far beyond anything Emily had previously managed. The scale of the project was both exciting and terrifying, representing the ultimate validation of everything the Foundation had accomplished while presenting challenges that could destroy the organization if not handled properly. Emily spent weeks analyzing the proposal, consulting with experts around the world, and calculating the resources that would be required. The financial investment would consume most of the Foundation's accumulated reserves, and success would depend on coordinating the efforts of dozens of specialists working in a foreign country under potentially difficult conditions. Failure would mean not just wasted money, with the possible loss of irreplaceable historical artifacts. The decision to accept the Eastern European project represented a leap of faith that challenged Emily's naturally cautious approach to restoration work. She had built her reputation through careful, methodical projects, where every variable could be controlled and every risk minimized. This new undertaking would require her to trust systems and people she couldn't directly supervise, while working under time constraints that left little margin for the kind of perfectionism that had characterized her previous work. The project began with Emily leading a small advance team to assess the condition of the aircraft and plan the restoration strategy. What they found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The underground storage had protected the planes from most environmental damage, leaving them in remarkably good condition for aircraft that had been abandoned for over 70 years. But the political complexities of working in a region still recovering from decades of communist rule created obstacles that Emily hadn't anticipated. Bureaucratic approval processes that should have taken weeks stretched into months, as various government agencies claimed jurisdiction over the historical artifacts. Local officials wanted to ensure that their country would benefit from the restoration project, while international preservation organizations insisted on oversight to prevent the aircraft from being sold to private collectors. Emily found herself navigating political waters that were far more treacherous than any mechanical challenge she had ever faced. The breakthrough came when Emily proposed a partnership arrangement that would leave several of the restored aircraft in the host country as the foundation for a new aviation museum, while allowing others to be distributed to museums and educational institutions around the world. The proposal satisfied most of the competing interests, while ensuring that the aircraft would be preserved for public benefit rather than private profit. The actual restoration work proved to be everything Emily had hoped it would be. Working with aircraft that had been preserved in near original condition allowed her team to study construction techniques and materials that were rarely found in aircraft that had seen decades of operational use. The project became a masterclass in World War II aviation technology, providing insights that influenced restoration techniques for projects around the world. But the Eastern European project also taught Emily valuable lessons about leadership and delegation that she couldn't have learned in her solitary work on the Ghost of the Pacific. Managing a team of specialists from different countries and professional backgrounds required skills in diplomacy and communication that complemented her technical expertise. She learned to trust others to handle aspects of the restoration that she would have previously insisted on controlling personally. The project's success established the Walker Aviation Heritage Foundation as the world's premier aircraft restoration organization, but it also marked the end of Emily's direct involvement in hands-on restoration work. The Foundation's projects had become too large and complex for any individual to maintain personal control over every detail, requiring Emily to evolve from master craftsman to organizational leader. The transition wasn't easy for someone who had found her calling working alone with hand tools in an overgrown field. Emily struggled with feelings of disconnect from the work that had originally inspired her passion for aviation preservation. Administrative meetings and media interviews couldn't replace the satisfaction of bringing a seized engine back to life or seeing an aircraft take flight for the first time in decades. Emily's solution was to establish a small, private workshop where she could continue working on personal restoration projects without the pressures and publicity that surrounded the Foundation's activities. The workshop became her refuge, a place where she could reconnect with the hands-on work that had launched her extraordinary career. She began taking on small, challenging projects that other restorers had deemed impossible, using them as opportunities to develop new techniques and maintain her connection to the craft that had changed her life. The private workshop also became a place where Emily could mentor individual students who showed exceptional promise. She selected only a few apprentices each year, choosing them based on their passion and dedication rather than their formal qualifications. The intensive, individualized training these students received carried on the tradition of craftsmanship that had been passed down through generations of skilled mechanics and craftsmen. One of Emily's most successful apprentices was David Kim, a former software engineer who had left his lucrative career to pursue his lifelong passion for aviation. David's analytical background and attention to detail made him naturally suited to restoration work, while his outsider's perspective often led to innovative solutions for technical challenges. Under Emily's guidance, David developed new methods for documenting and sharing restoration techniques that helped raise standards throughout the preservation community. The relationship between Emily and her apprentices was mutually beneficial, as their questions and fresh perspectives often forced her to reconsider established practices and explore new approaches. The teaching process helped Emily articulate knowledge that she had previously kept as intuitive understanding, converting experiential wisdom into techniques that could be systematically transmitted to others. As Emily approached her 30s, she began thinking about the long-term legacy of her work and the foundation she had built. The immediate goals of preserving specific aircraft and sharing restoration knowledge had been largely achieved, but she wondered about the broader impact of her efforts on aviation history and cultural preservation. The question of whether future generations would value and continue the work she had started became increasingly important to her. Emily's concerns were validated when she observed declining interest in aviation among young people who had grown up in an era of smartphones and social media. The mechanical fascination that had driven her own interest in aircraft restoration seemed less common among digital natives, who had little experience with hands-on problem-solving. She began developing new educational approaches that would connect aviation history with contemporary interests and technologies. The solution Emily developed involved creating immersive, interactive experiences that used modern technology to tell the stories of historical aircraft and the people who had built and flown them. Virtual reality systems allowed visitors to experience what it was like to fly a World War II bomber, while augmented reality displays revealed the internal systems and construction details of restored aircraft. The combination of historical preservation and cutting-edge technology attracted young visitors who might otherwise have little interest in aviation history. These innovative educational programs attracted attention from museums around the world, leading to partnerships that extended the Foundation's influence far beyond its physical facilities. Emily found herself consulting on exhibit designs and educational curricula that would introduce aviation history to new audiences in ways that honored both historical accuracy and contemporary learning preferences. The success of these programs validated Emily's belief that historical preservation had to evolve to remain relevant to changing audiences. The aircraft she had spent years restoring were more than mechanical artifacts. They were vehicles for transmitting knowledge, values, and cultural memories from one generation to the next. Ensuring that transmission required continuous adaptation of methods and approaches while maintaining absolute fidelity to historical accuracy and authentic craftsmanship. Emily's work had expanded far beyond anything she could have imagined during those early days working alone on the Ghost of the Pacific. The Foundation now employed over 100 specialists, operated facilities on 3 continents, and influenced restoration standards throughout the aviation preservation community. The scared young woman who had once worried about affording replacement parts for a rusted bomber had become one of the most respected figures in her field. But success had not changed Emily's fundamental approach to her work, or her commitment to the values that had guided her from the beginning. She still believed that every restoration project should be approached with respect for the original builders and users, that historical accuracy was more important than convenience or cost, and that the knowledge gained through restoration work should be shared freely with anyone willing to learn. The Walker Aviation Heritage Foundation had become Emily's lasting contribution to the preservation of aviation history, but she knew that institutions were only as strong as the people who sustained them. Her most important legacy would be the craftsmen and educators she had trained, the standards she had established, and the passion for historical preservation she had instilled in others. As Emily looked toward the future, she saw new challenges and opportunities emerging. Climate change was affecting the preservation of aircraft stored in outdoor environments, requiring new approaches to conservation and storage. International conflicts were threatening historical sites and collections around the world, creating urgencies for preservation efforts that couldn't wait for ideal conditions. Technological changes were creating new possibilities for documentation and education, while also creating new risks for traditional craftsmanship skills. But Emily faced these challenges with the same determination and methodical approach that had served her well since that morning when she first pushed through the weeds and discovered the Ghost of the Pacific. She had learned that seemingly impossible problems could be solved through careful analysis, persistent effort, and willingness to learn from both success and failure. The skills she had developed restoring a single aircraft had proven applicable to building an organization, developing educational programs, and influencing international preservation standards. The story that had begun with a young mechanic's stubborn refusal to let a piece of history rust away had evolved into something far larger and more significant than anyone could have predicted. Emily Walker had proved that individual determination could accomplish extraordinary things, but she had also demonstrated that lasting impact required building systems and training others who could carry the work forward into the future. The Ghost of the Pacific now served as inspiration for visitors to the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Its gleaming surfaces and perfectly restored systems testifying to what could be accomplished through skill, dedication, and refusal to accept that something was impossible. But the bomber's greatest significance might be that it had launched Emily Walker's career, setting in motion a chain of events that had preserved dozens of other aircraft and trained hundreds of craftsmen who would carry on the work of aviation preservation. Standing in her private workshop late one evening, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her from a cramped studio apartment to international recognition as a master restorer and educator. The path had been neither straight nor easy, filled with challenges she couldn't have anticipated and successes she had never dared to dream. But every step had been guided by the same simple principle that had driven her to tackle the restoration of the Ghost of the Pacific. If something was worth preserving, it was worth the effort required to do the job right. The sound of aircraft engines still thrilled Emily as much as it had on that first day when she had successfully started the Ghost of the Pacific's rebuilt Wright Cyclones. Every time a restored aircraft took flight, she experienced the same surge of pride and satisfaction that connected her to the original builders who had created these magnificent machines decades before her birth. That connection across time and generations was perhaps the most important thing Emily had discovered in her workshop behind Cedar Falls, the understanding that craftsmanship and dedication could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle. Emily Walker had found her calling in the most unlikely place, buried in weeds and forgotten by the world. What she had accomplished with that discovery had shocked the Air Force, amazed the aviation community, and inspired a new generation of preservationists. But perhaps most importantly, her work had proved that history wasn't something that belonged only to the past. It was a living connection between generations that could be maintained and strengthened by anyone willing to look carefully, work hard, and refuse to let important things be forgotten. The 10th anniversary of the Ghost of the Pacific's first flight approached with Emily reflecting on how much had changed since that transformative day. The Foundation now operated multiple facilities across North America and Europe, employed restoration specialists from around the world, and had successfully completed over 200 aircraft preservation projects. But with success came new responsibilities and challenges that tested Emily's leadership in ways she had never anticipated. The anniversary celebration was planned as more than just a commemoration of Emily's achievement. It would serve as a fundraising event for the Foundation's most ambitious project yet: the creation of a comprehensive digital archive that would preserve the technical knowledge and cultural stories associated with every aircraft they had restored. The project represented Emily's vision of ensuring that future generations would have access not just to the physical artifacts, but to the complete context of how these machines had been built, used, and preserved. Preparation for the anniversary event revealed how much Emily's role had evolved from hands-on restorer to cultural ambassador and institutional leader. She found herself coordinating with government officials, museum directors, and corporate sponsors while trying to maintain the authentic, grassroots character that had originally defined her work. The balancing act required diplomatic skills that she was still developing, often learning through trial and error how to navigate complex relationships while staying true to her core principles. The media attention surrounding the anniversary brought unexpected revelations about the Ghost of the Pacific's wartime service. A documentary film crew researching the bomber's history had uncovered classified military records that provided new details about the secret mission that had ended with the aircraft's emergency landing near Cedar Falls. The information painted a more complex picture of the events that had led to the bomber's abandonment, involving experimental radar technology and intelligence operations that had remained classified for decades. Emily learned that the Ghost of the Pacific had been carrying prototype equipment for a top-secret program designed to detect enemy submarines from the air. The technology had been revolutionary for its time, but the aircraft carrying the experimental gear had been forced to make an emergency landing when one of the prototype systems had overheated and started a small fire in the electronics bay. The crew had successfully landed the bomber, but the sensitive nature of their cargo had required military personnel to remove all evidence of the experimental equipment before abandoning the aircraft. This new information added another layer of historical significance to Emily's restoration work, but it also created complications she hadn't anticipated. The descendants of some crew members expressed concern about publicity that might reveal details of military operations their relatives had been sworn to keep secret. Government agencies that had declassified the documents wanted to ensure that any public discussion of the bomber's mission would be handled with appropriate sensitivity to ongoing national security concerns. Emily found herself mediating between competing interests while trying to honor both the historical importance of the new revelations and the legitimate concerns of people who had personal connections to the events. The situation required her to develop new protocols for handling sensitive historical information, establishing procedures that would guide the Foundation's work on future projects involving classified or potentially controversial subjects. The anniversary celebration itself became a powerful demonstration of how Emily's work had created connections between diverse communities that might otherwise have little interaction. Military historians mingled with local residents from Cedar Falls, while aviation enthusiasts from around the world shared stories with relatives of the Ghost of the Pacific's original crew. The event showcased the Foundation's role. As more than just a restoration organization, it had become a catalyst for preserving and sharing cultural memories that might otherwise be lost. The highlight of the celebration was a formation flight featuring the Ghost of the Pacific, alongside 3 other restored bombers from the Foundation's collection. Emily had planned to watch the flight from the ground, but at the last minute she decided to occupy the co-pilot's seat in the Ghost of the Pacific, returning to the cockpit of the aircraft that had launched her extraordinary career. As the 4 bombers thundered across the sky in perfect formation, Emily experienced a profound sense of completion and continuity that connected her present accomplishments to that first moment of discovery in the weeds behind Cedar Falls. The formation flight also served as a poignant reminder of how much the aviation preservation community had grown since Emily's early days working alone on the Ghost of the Pacific. The other bombers in the formation had been restored by teams trained in techniques that Emily had pioneered, using standards and procedures that had evolved from her original methodical approach to the work. The sight of multiple restored aircraft flying together represented the multiplication of her individual effort through the network of skilled craftsmen and dedicated preservationists she had helped to create. Following the anniversary celebration, Emily made a decision that surprised many of her colleagues and supporters. She announced that she would be stepping back from day-to-day management of the Foundation to focus on a new project that would return her to the hands-on restoration work that had originally inspired her passion for aviation preservation. The project involved an aircraft that was even more challenging than the Ghost of the Pacific had been. A prototype jet fighter from the early 1950s that had been damaged in a test flight and hidden away for decades. The decision to tackle another solo restoration project reflected Emily's recognition that her greatest contributions came from pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in aircraft preservation. While the Foundation could handle routine restoration work with established procedures and proven techniques, breakthrough projects required the kind of intensive, personal commitment that had characterized her work on the Ghost of the Pacific. Emily wanted to ensure that she maintained the innovative edge that had made her restoration work significant beyond its immediate accomplishments. The prototype jet presented technical challenges that were entirely different from anything Emily had previously encountered. Jet engines operated on completely different principles than the piston engines she had mastered, requiring her to learn new skills and develop new restoration techniques. The aircraft's advanced materials and construction methods represented technology that had been cutting edge for its time, but was now obsolete, creating difficulties in sourcing replacement parts and understanding premise. The original engineering intent. Emily approached the jet restoration with the same methodical documentation and research that had guided her work on the Ghost of the Pacific, but she also recognized that this project would require collaboration with specialists who had experience with early jet technology. She established partnerships with retired engineers who had worked on similar aircraft, military test pilots who had flown comparable machines, and materials scientists who could help her understand the metallurgy and manufacturing processes involved in the prototype's construction. The jet restoration became a proving ground for new techniques in aircraft preservation, particularly in areas involving advanced materials and complex systems integration. Emily developed innovative approaches to preserving composite materials that were degrading in ways that hadn't been anticipated by their original designers. She also pioneered methods for documenting and replicating manufacturing processes that had been used for only small numbers of experimental aircraft. The work attracted attention from aerospace companies and research institutions that were interested in understanding how early jet technology had evolved. Emily found herself consulting on projects that went beyond historical preservation to include engineering archaeology, using restored aircraft to understand design principles and manufacturing techniques that had influenced the development of modern aviation technology. The consulting work provided additional funding for the restoration project while creating new connections between historical preservation and contemporary aerospace development. As Emily worked on the jet restoration, she began developing ideas for her next major initiative, a comprehensive training program that would prepare the next generation of master restorers to handle increasingly complex preservation challenges. The program would combine traditional craftsmanship skills with cutting-edge technology, creating craftsmen who could work on everything from World War I biplanes to modern military aircraft. The training program represented Emily's recognition that the most important legacy of her work would be the people she had influenced and the knowledge she had helped to preserve and transmit. Individual restoration projects, no matter how successful, were less significant than the creation of systems and institutions that would ensure the continuation of high-quality preservation work. Emily wanted to establish a training program that would produce craftsmen who could exceed her own accomplishments while maintaining the standards and values that had guided her work from the beginning. The development of the training program required Emily to articulate and systematize knowledge that she had previously held as intuitive understanding. She worked with educational specialists to create curricula that would effectively transmit complex technical skills while also fostering the problem-solving mindset and attention to detail that characterized master-level restoration work. The process of developing the program helped Emily understand her own methods more clearly while creating resources that would benefit the entire preservation community. The program's first class of students included individuals from diverse backgrounds and countries, reflecting the international scope of the aviation preservation community that Emily's work had helped to create. Among the students was Sarah Chen, a young engineer from Singapore who had been inspired by Emily's story to leave a promising career in commercial aviation to pursue aircraft restoration. Sarah's analytical approach and cultural perspective brought new insights to traditional restoration techniques, while her enthusiasm reminded Emily of her own early passion for the work. Teaching the advanced restoration program challenged Emily to stay current with technological developments that were changing the field of historical preservation. Three-dimensional scanning and printing technologies were creating new possibilities for replicating parts that were no longer available, while advanced materials analysis techniques were providing unprecedented insights into how historical aircraft had been constructed. Emily had to master these new tools while ensuring that their use served the goals of historical accuracy and authentic craftsmanship, rather than simply convenience or cost reduction. The integration of new technologies with traditional skills became a central theme in Emily's teaching and consulting work. She advocated for approaches that used modern tools to enhance, rather than replace traditional craftsmanship, arguing that technology should serve the goal of better understanding and preserving historical artifacts, rather than creating shortcuts that might compromise accuracy or authenticity. Her balanced approach to technological innovation influenced preservation practices throughout the aviation community and beyond. Emily's work began attracting attention from preservation specialists working with other types of historical artifacts, including automobiles, ships, and industrial machinery. The principles and techniques she had developed for aircraft restoration proved applicable to other preservation challenges, leading to consulting opportunities that expanded her influence beyond aviation. Emily found herself advising on projects ranging from the restoration of steam locomotives to the preservation of early computer systems, applying her systematic approach to documentation and, quote, craftsmanship to diverse technological artifacts. The expansion of her consulting work beyond aviation reflected Emily's growing understanding of her role as more than just an aircraft restorer. She had become a leader in the broader field of technological preservation, someone who could articulate principles and methods that applied to any effort to maintain connections between past and present through the WWII preservation of material culture. This broader perspective influenced her approach to the Foundation's work and her thinking about the long-term significance of preservation efforts. As Emily entered her mid-30s, she began thinking about starting a family while maintaining her commitment to aviation preservation. The decision required her to consider how personal relationships and responsibilities would affect her ability to take on intensive restoration projects that had previously consumed all of her time and energy. She had spent over a decade building her career and reputation, but she also recognized that a complete life required more than professional accomplishment. Emily's relationship with David Martinez, a documentary filmmaker who had been following her work for several years, had evolved from professional collaboration to personal partnership. David understood the demands of Emily's work while bringing his own perspective on how to communicate the significance of preservation efforts to broader audiences. Their partnership represented a new phase in Emily's life that would influence both her personal development and her approach to sharing the importance of aviation preservation with the world. The question of how to balance personal fulfillment with professional commitment was one that Emily had observed other successful women in technical fields struggling with throughout their careers. She was determined to find an approach that would allow her to maintain her leadership in aviation preservation while also creating space for the personal relationships and experiences that would enrich her life. Beyond work, the challenge required her to delegate more responsibility to colleagues, while developing new ways to remain connected to the hands-on work that continued to inspire her passion for the field. Emily's journey from unknown small-town mechanic to internationally recognized leader in aviation preservation had demonstrated that extraordinary accomplishment was possible for anyone willing to combine talent with determination and persistence. But her story was still being written, with new chapters that would explore how sustained excellence in technical fields could be combined with a complete and balanced life. The lessons she was learning about leadership, collaboration, and personal growth would influence not just her own future, but also the advice and guidance she provided to the next generation of preservation specialists who looked to her as both technical expert and role model. The Ghost of the Pacific continued to fly regularly, serving as both a testament to Emily's skill and a symbol of what could be accomplished when historical preservation was approached with the highest standards of craftsmanship and historical accuracy. But the bomber's most important legacy might be that it had launched a career and created an institution that would ensure the preservation of aviation history for generations to come. Emily Walker had proved that individual vision and determination could create lasting change, transforming not just a single rusted aircraft, but an entire field of human endeavor.